In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum. Benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus.
Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostre. Amen.
Sancte Ioannes de Brebeuf.
Ora pro nobis.
Sancte Noel Chabanel.
Ora pro nobis.
Sancte Caroli Gagne.
Ora pro nobis.
Sancte Antoni Daniel.
Ora pro nobis.
Omnes Sancti Martyres.
Ora pro
In
nobis.
nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Okay, we continue. Some points worth considering. Some who are pounding the war drums for the 62 liturgy. Just some objective facts. One, we know in hindsight that Bugnini in his autobiography, which was published in 1992, and Archbishop Lefebvre died in 91. So maybe if he lived to read the whole thing, he might have adapted some thinking, perhaps, on this question. But Bugnini says very specifically, we will overthrow the old Mass in 7 stages, and one of those stages was the 62. And I grant, and I wouldn't argue, the 62 doesn't have anything openly heretical, doesn't have anything intrinsically against the faith. So one could say it, no problem. I said it for many years in the society. But was it a step towards the new Mass? You can't deny that. It certainly was. And in the most affected was the breviary. They ripped out all the second nocturnes. So on a practical level, the priests who are saying the pre-55 breviary in Mass, it's a lot more prayer. It's a lot more time in prayer. So how can you argue against that? Priests, that's good for priests. We need to pray. Secondly, Archbishop Lefebvre himself never observed the 62 liturgy strictly either. Never. He kept the second Confiteor. He kept the omission of the genuflection for the Jews on Good Friday. And numerous other points. I can't remember them all, but he himself and people who were in Econ at the time, they said Econ was kind of a mishmash of 62, 64, 65, pre-55. So, all right, that's another factor. And if they want to argue about, the papal obedience, well, let's face another fact, that Pope Francis granted permission to the St. Peter priest, and I think Christ the King Institute, to use the pre-55 Holy Week. So there you go. There's the implicit papal approval of using the pre-55 liturgy. So I don't think it's worth making a huge war over this question. I think any priest who comes to the conclusion that the pre-55 it's not shifty ground, it's solid ground. And it's the Mass and breviary that was said by all the saints, certainly all the saints since the 600s-700s. And even then the breviary was already established, because the Benedictine monastic life was around the breviary, which is essentially the same as now. So I don't think it's not worth making a war over. But even Archbishop Vigano said the SSPX should go back to the pre-55. I agree with that. But I wouldn't condemn a priest who stays with 62. I wouldn't do that. But Anyway,
I
yes.
was just going to say, plus the 62, as you said, only lasted 3 years.
Exactly.
The
3 years.
55 was said for hundreds of years.
Hundreds and hundreds of years. The beautiful thing, like the martyrs of today, St. John de Brébeuf, St. Charles Garnier, St. Noel Chabanel, St. Anthony Daniel, St. Gabriel Lallemant, St. Isaac Jogues, they all said this exact same Mass, because it's after the Council of Trent. So everything was solidified and clarified and unified. St. John Bosco, name some more saints. And this St. Philip Neri, St. Clement Hofbauer, all of them said the exact same Mass. If they said Mass this morning, it would have been exactly the same, with the 2 commemorations, the Benedicamus Domino. So, is it worth making a war over this question? No, because it's not primarily a doctrinal question, although it hinges on it. I don't think it's worth making a war over. I think it's foolish for those voices rising saying, no, you can't do pre-55. It's sedevacantist. Well, we're not sedevacantists, and we're doing the pre-55. And you have to stay with the 62 to be obedient to the Pope. Well, Pope Francis allowed the pre-55, so there you go. So, is it worth making a big war over this? Absolutely not. Is it worth making a war about condemning the new Mass? Yes. Because the new Mass makes people lose the faith. And so what about these bishops, How about they raise their voice and condemn new Mass miracles and condemn new Mass gives grace? Or at least treat the question the way Archbishop Lefebvre did, and not in favor of the new Mass, that's for sure. So it's not worth beating the war drums over this issue. It's just not. And quite honestly, where the pre-55 exists, there is a deepening of the faith, a deepening of piety, a tremendous love and respect for the Holy Mass. And in the English-speaking countries, that was the Mass of most of the priests. That includes England. Most of the traditional priests, in the beginning, were pre-55. In fact, the first priest, Bishop Lefebvre, ordained for the SSPX was Father Morgan, not Paul Morgan, another one. And he said the pre-55 Missal, I understand. So, all right, did Archbishop Lefebvre require SSPX members to sign on, I will keep the 62 liturgy? Yes, he did, and I signed it myself. But in hindsight now, seeing that the 62 really was a stepping stone to the new Mass, I think it's just a logical position to take. And it's not defiance to papacy. It's none of that. It's just, we want to be Catholic. And Bishop St. Pius X said, the first and indispensable source of the Catholic spirit is?
The liturgy.
Yes, participation in the liturgy. So, all right, let's continue the study. The bad effects, ill effects of the dialogue Mass form. So we left off, hence the impression is given that the lay people share responsibility with the priest for saying the Mass. Now, wasn't this one of the goals of Louis Boyer and Lambert Baudouin? Assembly theology. The assembly is the important thing. The spiritual presence of Christ in the people, which is not what the Mass is, but that was their goal, to shift the emphasis on the presence of Christ in the Holy Eucharist and the sacrifice of the altar to the assembly, the people. Michael, pick it up. We do not, of course, as we're on the second paragraph.
We do not, of course, include here the responses of the lay servers or the singing of the lay members of the choir as they perform their respective offices out of necessity, where there is an inadequate supply of clergy. They are, furthermore, distinguished from the congregation by the requirement to wear clerical dress. So there is no danger that the rest of the laity might consider themselves entitled to make vocal responses during the liturgy.
Yeah, so a clear distinction of clerics wearing cassocks and surplices, and then privileged altar boys and men who help to serve or chant. They also have to put on cassock and surplice.
So far, we have considered the impact of the dialogue mass on perceptions of the ordained priesthood. Now we will turn to its effects on lay participation in the liturgy, which was normally silent and contemplative before the introduction of dialogue.
Contemplative.
Contemplative before the introduction of dialogue.
Can you get that fan, please? Thanks. Anthony?
The Congregation of Rites made several responses to questions by bishops on the dialogue mass in 1921 and 1922, in which it was acknowledged that it can be a source of distraction not only for the priests, but also for the laity. On the 4th of August 1922, it stated, quote,
Okay, so who's speaking here? The Acta Apostolicae Sedis, the Congregation of the Rites. Go on.
quote, things that are in themselves licit are not always expedient, owing to the difficulties which may easily arise, as in this case, especially on account of the disturbances which the priests who celebrate and the people who assist may experience, to the disadvantage of the sacred action and of the rubrics. Hence, it is expedient to retain the common usage, as we have several times replied in similar cases, end quote.
Yeah, retain the common usage. In other words, priest and altar boy, congregation silent. Priest and altar boy recite the mass, make the responses, pray the prayers, and everyone else adore. Retain the common usage. And this is a very good point here, right? Things that in themselves are licit may not always be expedient. Things that may not be illicit to do, they're illicit, but they are licit, they're permitted, but it's not expedient to do it because it just causes more problems. Anybody think of an example on a practical level?
Something that's morally permissible, but maybe could give scandal.
Yeah, well, go on.
Commenting on the congregation's document, Baudouin admitted that the practice of the dialogue mass ran counter to Catholic tradition.
Ooh, big admission. Look at the footnote. L'introduction des messes dialogue est contraire à la tradition. Contrary to tradition, that's the French. Contrary to tradition. He admits it. That's a huge admission, isn't it? In other words, the dialogue mass is a novelty. And anything that's novel in the Catholic teaching is usually close to heresy, says St. Thomas Aquinas. He says that. Go on.
Therefore, he urged his followers to adopt stealth tactics and to treat the subject only, quote, with reserve, behind closed doors, and in select reviews, end quote, for fear of drawing disapproval from Rome.
Ooh, another modernist tactic. Avoid Rome's spotlight. That was Catholic Rome, not modernist Rome. So be sneaky, in other words, about this. Right? Be sneaky. Gain support, but don't be too loud about it. With reserve, behind closed doors, and in select reviews. That's Baudouin. What a sneak. Go on.
But if Pope Pius X had really recommended active participation for all, where is the need to pursue a covert operation in order to have it implemented? Besides, the faithful did not need an official organ of the Roman Curia to tell them that the dialogue form is an intrusion that radically changes the whole ethos and atmosphere of the Mass. First point. For For those trying to follow the prayers of the Mass silently and at their own pace in their missals, keeping up with the general flow of vocal responses from the rest of the congregation is a definite challenge.
Yeah, because some go slow, some go fast. I confess, I had the dialogue mass. I mean, I just respected it because it was always done up in St. Teresa's in Nicholville. And they probably still do the dialogue mass. It was established by Father Lafitte many years ago, and they just had it always in their custom. But I remember the dialogue mass, and it is true, everybody goes at the different speeds. Some respond quick, some in the back respond low, slow, some are loud, some are soft. So it's cacophonic. It's cacophonic, meaning a disordered assembly of sounds, which is not conducive to prayer at Mass, truthfully. Next point.
For others trying to pray in their own way, the continuous bombardment of sound from people close by, projecting their voices forcibly in the pews, can disturb their meditation.
True. Next point.
Experience also shows that dialogue tends to encourage an atmosphere of competitiveness, in which some people feel compelled to prove who can respond the loudest, thus creating a kind of decibel auction.
Yes, I could see this especially among children, right? Well, boys especially competitive. I respond louder than you, and I know my Latin smoother than you. Yes. Next point.
Dialogue also creates a two-tier system between those who can give the Latin responses correctly and those who cannot. Indeed, it is not uncommon for participants to garble the Latin phrases, which means that the dialogue mass gives them the opportunity, which they would not otherwise have, to talk meaningless nonsense without, of course, realizing it.
Next point.
There is the common problem, unavoidable in most cases, of a ragtag set of responses uttered at different rates of speed by the congregation. Overenthusiastic participants start responding even before the priest has finished speaking, while the stragglers insist on proclaiming their part after everyone else has fallen silent. This verbal melee is unbecoming in the liturgy.
It's very true. These points are very true. I've heard them because I've done the dialogue mass many times, and it's all true. Go on.
Next point. And yet there is no feasible way to train the laity as a whole and to continually monitor the loudness, speed, and strict timing of their responses without being oppressive. Common sense dictates that the whole idea is unworkable, where congregations composed of people with diverse backgrounds and abilities are involved.
True. It's not workable. It's not smooth. Go on.
Pius XII's instruction, De Musica Sacra, mentions that the active participation of the faithful needs to be regulated, apportet moderare, so that the danger of any abuse may be removed, ut periculum quisvis abusus amoviatur, but suggests no measures for achieving that aim. That would indeed have made interesting reading. So the bottom line of the reform is that, having dispensed with the custom of silent participation, which needed no monitoring or intrusive action from officialdom, the Holy See had no realistic or practical solution to the problem of regimenting the world's Catholics to dialogue in a manner fitted to the dignity of the liturgy.
Yes. Very good points. Liturgical rubrics do not apply to the laity in the pews.
At any rate, the idea of a requirement for the laity to be subject to rubrics intended to stipulate what they must say and do in the liturgy is fatuous. This is because, as Father Adrian Fortescue pointed out in 1920, quote, lay people in the body of the church enjoy a natural liberty, end quote, precisely because of their lay status, and also because the rubrics apply only to, quote, those who assist more officially, the server, clergy, others inquire, and so on, end quote.
So that's Father Adrian Fortescue, 1920. So the rubrics apply only to those basically in the sanctuary. Go on.
The movement started by Bourgoin to pressure the laity into active participation and dialogue with the priest constitutes an infringement of their natural liberty, qua lay people, to assist at Mass in silent prayer, and to be free to choose their own methods of spiritual participation. After all, this had been the default position for the laity since the early centuries of the liturgy. Showing respect for this time-honored tradition would avoid the unnecessary tension and confrontation which often arises over this issue between priests who favor the dialogue form and members of the congregation who prefer to pray silently at Mass. Even worse, where a priest finds dialogue unacceptable, certain members of the congregation who insist on their right to give the responses at Mass can appeal over his head to the local bishop in whose diocese he has given his permission for it, thus giving rise to a spirit of contention in the parish over a matter of immemorial tradition. Silence, they say, is golden. As for today's proponents of the dialogue method, a period of unlimited silence from that quarter should indeed be golden. In the following chapters, we will be looking at ways in which Popes Pius XI and Pius XII gave an increasing degree of official impetus to the revolutionary idea of active participation, including, specifically, the dialogue Mass. Following Baudouin's lead, they officially endorsed and validated this progressive position by providing approval and direction for its implementation in the Church.
Pius XI's progressive legislation. The background of resistance to Pius X's motu proprio. After the publication of Pope Pius X's motu proprio, there was a great deal of support around the world for the formation of choirs to sing Gregorian chant in the liturgy. But there were also pockets of resistance, especially to the prohibition of women in the ecclesiastical choir. The primary concern of the liturgical movement was the promotion of, quote, active participation of everyone in the liturgy. The American bishops had been campaigning for congregational singing for decades before the official start of the liturgical movement in an attempt to accustom lay people to sing parts of the liturgy. Footnote, at the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore, 1884, they demanded that, quote, the major part, at least of the faithful, will learn to chant with clergy and choir in the Vesper service and such like. 1886. I'll go on, Michael. Also,
in the United States, Virgil Michel's Orate Fratres, founded in 1927, furthered Baudouin's aims for involving the laity in spoken and sung responses. The renowned musical educator and choral conductor, Justin Ward, a wealthy benefactress to the Church, organized in 1920 International Congress on Gregorian Chant at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. What she wants above all, wrote Dom Gottard OSB, prior of Farnborough Abbey, who was at the Congress, is to put the faithful, all the faithful, in the position to participate actively as much as possible in the liturgy and in the chant of the Catholic Church, end quote. She especially encouraged girls choirs. In a private audience in 1924, Pope Pius XI gave her work his apostolic blessing. Reactions against the ban on female members of the choir ranged from indifference to outright defiance. In 1904, the American bishops, led by Cardinal Gibbons, refused to implement Pius X's ban on women choir members on the grounds that it would cause too much resentment and be impossible to implement.
okay, footnote, Archbishop, later Cardinal Gibbons, who presided over the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore, was an enthusiastic promoter of congregational singing and wrote extensively on its alleged benefits in his work, The Ambassador of Christ. So remember, Cardinal Gibbons was the big liberal. It was because of him that Leo XIII wrote 2 encyclicals condemning Americanism. And Gibbons was he wrote the book Faith of Our Fathers. And in the second printing, he was proud of it because he removed anything that offended the Anglicans and the Protestants. So he was very ecumenically minded. He was quite a liberal. He's the one that said, if I could change one word of the Constitution, I wouldn't touch it. He believed in the goodness of public schools as well. And so Leo XIII gave him a slap on the hand. So it's not surprising he would be in favor of all this. Go on.
An article in the Baltimore Sun in 1907 declared that the prohibition would be impracticable. Impracticable. Its author mentioned that, quote, Cardinal Gibbon is loath to do away with women in the church choirs, as he says that it interrupts the harmony of the music, especially in a country like this, where there is little male talent to be relied on, end quote. Excuses were made that not enough boys could be found, though no record of efforts to find them was mentioned, and that their training would be too costly for the parishes. Justine Ward, who refused to be dictated to in musical matters by any pope, stamped her foot and said, quote, we have always sung as at present. These tunes have been sung by our fathers before us, and we like them. We have always played the organ during Advent and Lent. We have always listened to the singing of Arias by a solo voice, usually female. We have always omitted the proper of the day at High Mass. All these things and others of like nature are a custom of long standing, and we will not tolerate any newfangled notions in this church.
Ooh, Justine. Ooh, she's getting a little hot-headed here. We will not tolerate any newfangled notions in this church. In other words, Pius X, step back. We women are in charge now. Go on.
A more complete collection of liturgical abuses tolerated by some of the American bishops, which flew in the face of Pope Pius X's motu proprio, could hardly be imagined. Requests continued to pour into the Vatican throughout the reign of Pope Pius XI for the use of the Dialogue Mass. The Congregation of Rites responded in private letters to the bishops of Mantua in 18th of February 1921, Pesaro, Italy, 25th of February 1921, Malines, 27th of April 1921, unnamed, 4th of August 1922, and Genoa, 30th of November 1935, to say that lay responses in the liturgy are considered, quote, quote, not expedient, end quote, that the custom of silent participation should be respected, and that the issue is for the local bishops to decide.
The Apostolic Constitution Divini Cultus, 1928. Anthony?
It was against the background of this onslaught that Pope Pius XI published his 1928 document on sacred music in an attempt to conciliate hostile opposition and open the field of sacred music to more liberal attitudes. In it, Pope Pius XI exhorted the congregation to participate actively in the liturgy, saying, quote, in order that the faithful may more actively participate in divine worship, let them be made once more to sing the Gregorian chant, so far as it belongs to them to take part in it, end quote. In its Latin version, the word actuosios, more actively, is used in connection with the participation of the people. It was a remarkable innovation, as it was the first time in the history of the Church that such a term was used in an official Latin document to describe the laity's participation in the liturgy. To reinforce the point, Pius XI specified whose voices should be heard in the church, quote, the voices of the clergy, the choir, and the congregation. Emphasis added. Thus, he included the laity in the same category as the clergy, who are in duty bound to sing the liturgy. It also marks a distinct break with Catholic tradition. In his motu proprio, Pius X did not allot a role for the congregation to sing Gregorian chant, or even suggested that, quote, it belongs to them to take part in it, end quote. On the contrary, he had said the opposite, that apart from what is sung by the celebrant and his ministers at the altar, quote, all the rest of the liturgical chant belongs to the choir, end quote.
Footnote, Pope Pius X, Motu Proprio 1903, paragraph 12. Apart from the singing of the celebrant at the altar and of his ministers, which must always be sung in Gregorian chant and without accompaniment of the organ, what remains of the liturgical chant belongs to the choir of Levites. So Pius X does not say the congregation, he says the choir of Levites, that is, the ordained clerics. Okay, so another source of confusion in Divini Cultus is the following statement. It is most important, quote, that when the faithful assist at the sacred ceremonies or when pious sodalities take part with the clergy in a procession, they should sing alternately with the clergy or the choir, whether in the language of the liturgy or in the vernacular. Go on, Gabriel.
In this passage, where the congregation is actually instructed to sing the responses, confusion reigns between liturgical and non-liturgical situations. Pius X had made a crucial distinction between ceremonies which take place inside the church and religious events which take place outside the church, such as processions, pilgrimages, etc. In the former case, singing is a strictly liturgical function reserved for the clergy and choir. In the latter, all the faithful were permitted to sing hymns in any language.
Again, footnote, Pope Pius X, Motu Proprio 1903, paragraph 21. In processions outside the church, the ordinary, that is the bishop, may give permission for a band to accompany some spiritual canticles sung in Latin or in the vernacular by the singers, and the pious associations which take part in the procession. Also, lay people were permitted to sing hymns in any language outside the church.
Inside.
What?
Inside. Also, lay people were permitted to sing hymns in any
Oh, inside the church, at non-liturgical ceremonies such as novenas, sodalities, Stations of the Cross. So, yeah, we do know that St. John Bosco had a band, not inside the church, but outside. When they would process through the streets, they would sing hymns with the band playing. Anyway, probably popular Italian hymns. Behind the scenes lobbying. Go on.
What is not always appreciated about Divini Cultus is the fact that prior to its publication, a robust lobbying operation had been going on in the Vatican to achieve the goal of active participation in the liturgy. Pius XI admitted that he was being influenced by lobbyists. Quote, we are thus acceding to the requests which have been made to us by not a few bishops and various musical congresses, end quote. This shows that the progressivist foxes were already sniffing around the Vatican henhouse, waiting for a pope to lift the latch. No names of the bishops are mentioned in the document, but we gather from their episcopal sees that Baudouin's protector, Cardinal Mercier of Malines, was one of them. As an ardent supporter of Baudouin's movement, Cardinal Mercier had, according to his biographer, quote, made every possible effort to introduce the practice of congregational singing into his diocese, end quote, long before Divini Cultus was published. So, as far as active participation is concerned, it was not exactly the church speaking, but a handful of agenda-driven enthusiasts clamoring for policy changes who had gained the ear of the Pope.
Okay, it needs to be mentioned here also that, remember, Our Lady of Fatima mentioned Pius XI. The children didn't know who it was. They thought it was maybe some king. But this was in 1917. And he wouldn't be ascending the throne until after Pope Benedict XV in the 20s. So in 1929 was the official request of Our Lady of Fatima to Sister Lucia, now is the time to consecrate Russia. And Pope Pius XI should have done it, but he didn't do it. So is it possible that he lost the grace or lost some graces to navigate through these attempts of the progressives to push in the dialogue mass and all this lay participation? So it's worth considering. All right. In fact, Michael?
In fact, the American bishops had already prevailed upon the Congregation of Rites to modify Pius X's restrictions on who could sing Gregorian chant in the liturgy. In 1908, the Congregation of Rites received a request from New York on behalf of almost all the bishops of the United States and issued a decree granting them permission for female choir members to perform outside the sanctuary. Unfortunately, this concession was bound to cause confusion by introducing a principle of relativism into the nature of a church choir. If the women's choir could sing the responses to the male choir, and even perform the singing in their absence, as the 1908 decree stipulated, the impression is given that there is no practical distinction between them. With Pius X seeming to waver on this issue and give in to pressure, the significance and force of his 1903 legislation were greatly undermined and left open to contempt by his successors and by the world's bishops. This was an outcome that he had wished to avoid in the conclusion to his motu proprio. He had urged all who were in charge of choirs, particularly the diocesan bishops, to observe his instructions, quote, so that the authority of the church, which herself has repeatedly proposed them, and now inculcates them, may not fall into contempt, end quote. Whereas Pius X had ordered that liturgical chant should be taught to seminarians and clerics and restricted to their use, Pius XI now extended this instruction to the whole Catholic population, starting in the schools. To this end, he told heads of religious communities of women, as well as men, to, quote, devote particular attention to the achievement of this purpose in the various educational institutions committed to their care, end quote. It was a subtle concession to
recalcitrant bishops
around the world. Predictably, such a radical step, which reverses the traditional position, would lead to a divisive situation, with bishops everywhere taking the part of Pius XI against Pius X, and leading the faithful to do likewise.
The Australian wrangle, Anthony.
There is an interesting historical account of two Australian archbishops at the turn of the 20th century who were at loggerheads with each other over the correct interpretation of Pope Pius X's motu proprio, and managed to turn their respective dioceses into a liturgical battleground. Even before 1903, Archbishop John O'Reilly of Adelaide had started a national campaign for the promotion of sacred music, strictly in accordance with Pope Pius X's principles. But the Archbishop of Sydney, Cardinal Patrick Moran, was determined to resist the papal command and continue pandering to popular taste in music. Moran contended that the motu proprio applied only to the church in older, established countries, and was not binding in missionary areas such as Australia. As a result, the liturgy in his archdiocese was awash with the type of music expressly retrograded by Pius X. As an example of the type of singing chosen by Moran for the solemn high mass celebrated in St. Mary's Cathedral, at the Australasian Catholic Congress held in Sydney in 1909, a female soloist sang in an aria, which would have been considered by Pius X as unsuitable for Catholic worship. The outcome of the dispute between the two prelates reflected unfavorably on the policy of Pope Pius XI towards recalcitrant bishops. When Archbishop O'Reilly's representative lodged a formal complaint against Cardinal Moran to the Secretary of State, Cardinal Mary Del Val, in Rome, his letter was deliberately sidelined and left unanswered.
Silent participation is stigmatized and becomes taboo. Gabriel.
Everyone in the ambit of the present day Novus Ordo regime has by now accepted that silent participation in the liturgy is to be utterly
Eschewed.
Avoided. But that idea did not originate with Pope Pius X. It all started with Baudouin's launching of the liturgical movement and was officially enshrined for the first time in a papal document by Pius XI, who indicated in Divini Cultus his desire for vocal participation by all. Quote, "It will no longer happen that the people either make no answer at all to the public prayers, whether in the language of the liturgy or in the vernacular, or at best utter the responses in a low and subdued manner." End quote. A disturbing feature of this remark is its emphasis on both externalism and intolerance. No one can claim that the act of singing or speaking promotes their participation, nor can it be established with any certainty that participation will be enhanced by raising the decibel level of vocal responses from the laity. Pope Pius X, for his part, had never made such claim.
Detached and silent spectators. Its origin can be traced to Baudouin's ill-conceived theories for active participation. These were dredged up by Pius XI and called in evidence to refuse countenance to Catholics wishing to pray silently during Mass, whom he termed detached and silent spectators. The Pope's choice of words was perhaps more revealing than he intended. Baudouin had expressed the selfsame idea in 1922, using the pejorative French phrase, dumb and idle spectators. These words display a disregard for the crucial distinction between detachment and silence. Both are conflated in Divini Cultus and given equally negative publicity, an opprobrium that also attaches to Catholics who choose not to make their voices heard during Mass. Henceforth, they would be fed to the liturgical lions to be harried, mocked, rebuked, cajoled, placed under suspicion, publicly denounced, and sent on a guilt trip to make them sing or shout up during Mass. The patterns of thought regarding active participation, which would eventually subvert the Church's liturgy, were already present in the mind of Pope Pius XI when he attempted to rid the Church of the traditional method of silent participation. The logical outcome of his intolerance in this regard would be the tyranny of the Novus Ordo regime. Paul VI stated ominously in a general audience on November 26, 1969, that the new Mass was, quote, intended to interest each one of those present, to draw them out of their customary personal devotions or their usual torpor. Observatorio Romano, December 4th, 1969. He went so far as to forbid the silent praying of private prayers, including the Rosary, during Mass. During the Mass. So here's a quote from Paul VI, which we'll pick up next time. Adjutorium nostrum in nomine Domini.